All right, it's 1:30 and thank you for showing up on Friday. It's been a long week and I am so over Zoom. That's why I'm not using it right now. I'm really glad we're not using Zoom because too many meetings today. So we're going to finish up the appendicular skeleton and move on to joints today. And I apologize, you probably saw the blooper or you live or on the recording. So I apologize for yes, you, but I can't get mad at him. But the thing is, like, yeah, it's kind of really funny. If you were here last time, you saw Peanut. Somehow, like, you could hear him in the backgrounds. But it's so funny. Like 3 hours later, he was calm, and then he's like this, and still helping me with my work. Yeah. So these birds are really great. They're great companions. But I mean, sometimes they can be a little loud, but sometimes they can also like add to your productivity in their own special way. All right. So back to our lesson. Okay, so we finished the appendicular skeleton in terms of the upper part. So we talked about the shoulder slash pectoral girdle and also the upper limb. But now let's talk about the lower part. So let's talk about the pelvic girdle and and your lower limbs, aka your legs. All right, so again, remember another analogy for the girdles is that they're like clamps that attach your arms and legs to your axial skeleton. So again, the axial skeleton is that skull, rib cage, the vertebral column, but the pectoral and shoulder girdle and the pelvic girdle, they are not part of your axial skeleton. They attach to your axial skeleton, but they're actually part of your appendicular skeleton. Okay, so this I uploaded on your slides. This is for your reference. So this is the Martini version. Again, you already have the OpenStax version online. Okay, so then here we have the acetabulum. So with this, we're looking at the right hip bone, but we're looking at it from the side, the outer side of the hip bone. So we're not actually looking from the inside. And acetabulum, so it's this little cup right here. And why does it have that really long, complicated name? So it comes from a Latin word meaning vinegar cup. Or if you're like Filipino and you've ever had like the lumpia, you dip it into that small saucer of vinegar, that little cup of that. So think of it like that. That's like a little vinegar cup, but it forms your hip socket instead of dipping your fried stuff or whatever delicious stuff in that vinegar sauce. All right. So then there are three main parts. They fuse together, but there are three bones that make up one side of your pelvic or girdle. So each is called, all together, it's called a coxal bone, coxal. So here we're seeing only one half of it. So what we see here is the most superior part is called the ilium. This part is called the ischium, and this one part is called the pubis. All right, so what we're seeing the outer view in those previous pictures, but now we're seeing the inner side of this, the coxal bone. So what we have here, remember the ilium, that's the very top. And remember when we talked about bone markings and what's the top of a wave? So the very top of the ilium is what we call the iliac crest for a little review. And what we have here is, so we're seeing that from the side, but again, the very top, the most superior part of the superior bone of the coxal bones and your pelvic girdle. Now there's something called an auricular surface, so you can't actually see this in the intact skeleton, but say you separate a hip bone, a pelvic girdle from the sacrum and the axial skeleton. So what we see here is this part, rough patch right here. So usually this part is kind of sewn together and fused together with all the collagen that helps keep the hip bones connected to the sacrum. So auricular, it sounds like audio, right? So it does come from auricle, which means it looks like an ear. So it does kind of roughly look like an ear in this shape right here. So this is what we call the auricular surface, and this is what joins the ilium to the sacrum. So just like how the clavicle is the point of attachment of the shoulder and pectoral girdle to the actual axial skeleton, this is where you actually attach that pelvic girdle to the axial skeleton. It's at this part surface right here. So it's the ilium and sacrum together. These form the sacroiliac joint. So again, that's important because that's the part that helps to stabilize and attach your pelvic girdle to your axial skeleton. All right, so there's also something important. So that was on the posterior back side of your pelvic girdle. What's this part in the front? So it's not black, it's just in real life, it's just showing that for illustrative purposes. Just like that bright cherry red cartilage we saw in the rib pictures last lecture. This is supposed to represent a very tough type of fibrocartilage, and this is called the pubic symphysis. So the pubic symphysis, you have the sacroiliac joints joining to the axial skeleton back here, but the pubic symphysis helps also to hold the two coxal bones together. So all together, this makes up your pelvic girdle. Now, everyone knows where their pubic area, right? So that's the part in front. So this little bump, remember tubercles are very small bumps. So this little bump you see in the front of the pelvic girdle in the pubic area, that's the pubic tubercle, and that's what we see here. And then you have this greater sciatic notch. So where's the greater sciatic notch? Well, it's a really big notch. And hey, what nerve do you think runs through that notch? Maybe a nerve called the sciatic nerve. So sometimes you have to know these bone markings not for trivia, but often they lend their names or derive their names from some of these bone markings as well. So the sciatic nerve, a big, thick nerve. Don't worry too much about it right now. You will cover it in exam 3. But again, why do you have a big notch? Well, if it's a big nerve that runs through it, then you might want a lot of space for that nerve to have room. And then you have something called the ischial spine. So then remember, your pubic bone is in the front, and then what's by a process of elimination, you have the ischium in the back. So toward the posterior side, you have something called the ischial spine up here. And so think about how you're sitting. So you're actually sitting on if you're sitting, or assuming you're not standing up, you're sitting on if you're in your seat somehow, you're sitting on your pelvic girdle on some point. Which part of your pelvic girdle are you sitting on right now? Are you sitting on your pubic area? No, that would be awkward, right? And you wouldn't be facing the camera anyway. Or you would be, if you're doing a very weird position, or you have one of those like weird chairs, or using one of those yoga balls, maybe you're sitting somewhere else, but you're most likely sitting on this part right here. And this is called the ischial tuberosity. Again, tuberosity generally bigger than a tubercle, and this is what you're sitting on right now. So I like to think of it this way. If you're skiing and you fall on your butt, which bone are you going to sit on? You're going to sit on your ischium, and more specifically, if you're sitting down, you're sitting on your ischial tuberosity. So that's another big important bone marking. And then you have something called the Obturator Foramen. Notice that it's not just like a solid bone. There's a big, big hole in it, right? So this is what we call the Obturator Foramen. And hey, just like the greater sciatic notch, what nerve do you think runs through the Obturator Foramen? Maybe the obturator nerve, right? And other things can run through it as well. But the Obturator Foramen, again, it's a big hole because many things run through it. And again, when you have a hole, typically some sort of soft tissue goes through it. And this is what we see here. So it's kind of like when you look at the pelvic girdle from the front, it kind of looks like this. So that little eye holes, those would be the Obturator Foramen, or foramina, plural. All right, so there are more bone markings, but those are the ones for the lecture I definitely want you to know. And let's talk about the pelvis itself. So here we have the pelvic brim, and the false pelvis includes this whole entire part, including the crest. So that's what we have with the false pelvis and the pelvic brim. Now the true pelvis is actually this dark, or not dark, but this kind of like purplish lavender color. So notice that it's actually in this brim that forms the actual true pelvis. The false pelvis includes the iliac crest, but the pelvic brim forms the true pelvis. And why is that important? Well, if a woman's pregnant and she's delivering her baby, where does the baby have to pass through? Well, it's sitting up here above the false pelvis, but eventually, assuming it's not a cesarean birth, if it's delivered the natural way, then it'll go through the true pelvis. And speaking of that, so let's talk about general sex differences. Now, sex differences in the skull, it's really hard to tell from the pictures in Martini and on OpenStax. I think it's really hard to tell sex differences in between a male and female skull if you don't actually have a skull itself. So if I do test you on this, it probably won't be based on pictures because, again, it's really hard to tell from pictures without the 3D structure. But what we see with sex differences in the skull, the ones I have highlighted, maybe I'll test you on. So it says like a more sloping forehead in men, a larger, more robust mandible, so a bigger jaw in men in general. And then brow ridge. So man, we're kind of like cavemen. We have heavy brow ridge, and then female smoother. But again, this is very general. It's not always, but typical male versus female skull. And then glabella. It's the glabella right over here. So this is like prominent, but again, it's hard to see in this picture. So don't worry about if I'm going to show you one of these skulls and ask if it's male or female. Again, that's kind of tough based on just drawings. And even the orbital structure, I mean, that's really hard to tell from this. Mastoid process is pretty consistent. Like men, on average, have a larger mastoid process than women. So again, that part you can feel in the back of your ear, that mastoid process. And the bony palate, again, is talking about just like the overall jaw structure. Is it more narrow and less wide? So that's what we're talking about. But again, don't worry, fixate too much on that. Same with the pelvis, although it's, I think, a little easier to tell sex differences in the pelvis, especially from drawings and photographs, than it is telling difference between a male and female skull just based on photographs. So I'll give you just some general markers. There's many listed in the Martini book, and I have this chart up here on the slides. But what have we noticed? Well, again, that iliac crest. Notice that men have narrower hips, whereas there's more flare. It's more flared and wider between the iliac crest and the female pelvis. And why is that? Well, remember that if a woman gets pregnant, she has to deliver that baby, right? So which would be easier to deliver through? A very narrow pelvis, false pelvis, and true pelvis, or a wider false and true pelvis? Yeah, so again, a wider pelvis means easier childbirth, and that's what we have here. So again, this part right here, the sacrum, that also plays, not only does the pelvic brim and the true pelvis width play a role, but also the position of the sacrum and coccyx as well. So what we see in the female coccyx and sacrum is that it points inferiorly and points, compared to the male pelvis, it points a little more posterior and inferior, so a little more toward the back and down. And why is that? Again, you want more when you're trying to deliver that baby, you want it to have as much room as possible so you can deliver that baby through the true pelvis and birth canal. Now, what about the male sacrum and coccyx? Well, compared to the female sacrum and coccyx, the male one points a little more anteriorly. So what do you have here? Well, now you have not, well, in the male pelvis, it's also narrow. Say it was possible for men to give birth. Well, assuming that they somehow get past the true pelvis, then you have the sacrum and coccyx. And if you have less room right here, it's going to have a harder time. So that's why sometimes if a woman has a sacrum and coccyx that points more anteriorly, that might also obstruct the birth as well. But again, in general, male versus female in terms of the pelvis and sacrum and coccyx. So again, wider pelvic inlet and outlet in the female. In general, the male pelvis is wider. Now why did I make a big deal about that pubic symphysis? Well, this is also a dead giveaway, or in most cases, this is the way I kind of like go to when I'm trying to determine between a male and female skeleton. I look at the angle between the pubic bone and the vertex right here is at the pubic symphysis. So I kind of look at this angle right here. So a very general rule of thumb, if you have your two fingers and it's kind of like this, or like this, so this is more of a male angle with your index and middle finger. But the angle between your thumb and your index finger, that's more of the angle you see at the pubic symphysis with the female. So if I think, okay, is it more like this angle? Oh, I shouldn't do that. This angle or this angle? So again, the wider angle is typical of the pubic angle is typical of the female pelvis. So in general, the female pelvis is wider in most aspects. Right, so again, if you don't know what a 90-degree angle is, then again, back to geometry. A square, rectangle, right angles, that's a 90-degree angle.